Hi, I'm Jay Wertz, and welcome to the Monroe Publications YouTube channel with a special presentation for today, which is the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam, which we refer to in the title as Bloody Wednesday because that's the day it occurred on, is actually the bloodiest day in American history. September has a sad commentary in American history because it is not only the month in which one bloodiest event happened, but two. And the second would be, of course, the brutal terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. But we're here today to talk about the Battle of Antietam, everything that led up to it, and the aftermath. And I am joined by Dr. Thomas G. Clemens, who is an educator, preservationist, and guide. He served many years in advising on acquiring additional land at Antietam by the American Battlefield Trust and his predecessor. He is now a battlefield guide there, licensed by the National Park Service. He's also, by the way, a former educator, retired emeritus, and a book author and contributor. So welcome, Tom. We are so happy to have you with us today to talk about really a pivotal event in the history of the Civil War and American military history, and that's the Battle of Antietam. And I want to start by talking about the things that led to the battle itself on the soils of Maryland, Western Maryland. And that, of course, was the rise of Confederate success, particularly in the East, in the summer of 1862, and the emergence of Robert E. Lee as the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, which was the storied and largest group of Confederate military soldiers in that time period and through the rest of the war. So they were successful, first against McClellan in the 7 Days battles. They moved north, battled forces under a new federal commander, John Pope, at Cedar Mountain, 2nd Manassas. And then they ended up turning towards Washington and were just barely to the Potomac River, crossing into Washington itself, when they were held up at the Battle of Chantilly, which started the month of September 1st. And that confused battle there resulted in the death of two revered federal commanders, Generals Philip Kearny and Isaac Stevens. But nevertheless, at that point, Lee decided to not challenge the Washington fortifications, but instead turn north and head into Maryland. There may have been some overconfidence, perhaps, by a very victorious Confederate army. There may have been some political ramifications, including what other nations, particularly European nations that were watching the conflict, were going to do. And there may have been other logistical and political considerations on Lee's mind and that of the Confederate leadership when they decided to launch this campaign in September of 1862 into Maryland. Tom, would you please tell us what some of these considerations were and how you think that they were set up to play into the battle that we now know?
Well, thank you, Jay. A pleasure to be with you. Yes, I see the fall of 1862 or late summer into fall of 1862 as the high tide of the Confederacy. Not only is Lee moving into Maryland, but you've got Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg leading armies through Tennessee into Kentucky. You've got Earl Van Dorn crossing the Mississippi River, trying to recapture Corinth, Mississippi. You literally have a Confederate offensive on almost 1,000-mile front from the Mississippi River to the Potomac River. And you'll never see that again during the war. So this is the time. Foreign recognition, certainly the diplomatic folks in Richmond were concerned about the fact that England and France were not stepping up like the Confederacy hoped they would. They had believed that England particularly was dependent on Southern cotton for their economy. And by starving the English cotton mills, they would force England's hand to come and support them, just like the French had supported us in the Revolution. Didn't happen, but certainly that is in the minds of the Southern diplomats and Southern politicians. Lee, of course, is not speaking about that, may or may not have been aware of it, but he has other considerations in his mind. As you pointed out, he's riding a tide of success for the most part, and would like to keep the string going. He believes that the way to end the war is to carry it into the North and make the Northern public feel the hard hand of war, and that this will demoralize the Northern support for the war, which would be expressed in October and November in the midterm elections in the various states in the North. And Lee mentions that in his dispatches, that the coming elections are a big factor. If enough peace Democrats are elected to Congress, they could force Lincoln's hand in ending the war. And so Lee is trying to work on Northern morale and hoping that morale will be expressed through political means. He really, I think on a tactical level, Lee is sitting outside of Washington, D.C. with an army of about 75,000 men and equipped with light field guns. Washington, D.C. at that point in time contains the remnants of Pope's defeated army from Second Manassas, the troops from McClellan's Army of the Potomac that have been withdrawn from the peninsula. Burnside's North Carolina expedition has returned and are in Washington, D.C. And the July call for 300,000 more Union volunteers has yielded fruit. And there are probably close to 30,000 new troops in Washington, D.C. So that the Washington, D.C. garrison has between 130 and 140,000 soldiers. It also has a chain of earthen and log forts that surround the city, and they have huge siege guns that can throw a 100-pound projectile in excess of a mile. So if Lee tries to attack Washington, D.C., it's not going to be successful, almost certainly. More troops there than he has, bigger guns. And Lee cannot bring up big guns because the bridges on the railroads connecting him to Richmond have been burned. So he has, I'll narrow it down to 4 options, or 3 options. Let's say 3 options. He can attack DC. Well, that's not a good idea. He could stay where he is in Northern Virginia, let the Union Army come to him. But as I point out, he can't bring up guns to defend a position. And Northern Virginia, a year and a half into the war, is already picked clean of food. And it's going to be the logistics that is going to be Lee's Achilles heel, feeding and supplying his army. So he can't attack, he can't defend, he's got to move. Well, where does it make any sense to move? Back to Richmond? No. You know, you've just fought your way up to Washington. Why would you retreat and give up that ground? Eastward, if you go below Washington, the river is too wide to be crossed with pontoon bridges, so he's just putting himself out on a limb. Westward into the Shenandoah Valley, he could feed and sustain his army. He can communicate with Richmond by rail, but he's not threatening Washington from Shenandoah Valley like he would be if he was in Maryland. And so northward into Maryland is tactically the only logical thing and satisfies a lot of the strategic goals of the Confederate States of America.
Well, that's a great description of what set up the campaign. And you gave a great description of the armies that were poised at that point in just a few hundred square miles of the United States in the largest concentration in the East. Of course, as you mentioned, there were also other campaigns and other armies in the Kentucky, Tennessee area and in the Mississippi area. And of course, beyond the Mississippi and in the Trans-Mississippi. But this was the big show. This was the one that was going to get all the attention. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the leadership of these 2 Federal and Confederate armies and see how that might play, how the personalities might play in the upcoming campaign and battle. We'll be right back. discussion of something that happened this day, September 17th, 160 years ago in Western Maryland. That was the Battle of Antietam and the campaign surrounding it. We have described the armies that were involved to some degree, and certainly the reasons why General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia decided to move into Maryland. Tom has described very well the factors in Lee's mind that led to him to decide to go north into Maryland rather than any other options that he may have had at the time. But really, we have to go back a little bit and talk about the emergence of Robert E. Lee, how he in a very short time became a changing from almost sometimes a derisive joke in the Confederate Army, evacuating Lee and granting Lee with some of his earlier failures. He was, after all, an engineer, and his ability as an engineer in fort building preceded the war, and he had great respect then. But when it came to the war, he was initially just an advisor to Jefferson Davis and not very well thought of in the ranks of the Confederate Army. But that quickly changed through, again, his successes, and I think his relationship with his other the government people and the other leaders that served with him and under him, and I think also his broad vision. Tom, let's talk a little bit about the emergence of Robert E. Lee and those that ended up serving him not only in the Battle of Antietam but often years later.
Well, Jay, I think you've hit a very important point here, and that is the relationship between Robert E. Lee and the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. These two men are both graduates of the military academy at West Point. They trust each other and have confidence in each other. That's critical in any working relationship like this. And as you hinted at, it's not the same on the Union side. And we'll get into that in a moment. But yes, Lee's role in the war to this point had not been very spectacular. Before he was a military advisor to Davis in Richmond, he was on the South Carolina-Georgia coastline, looked out at Fort Pulaski as the Union were attempting to bombard that fort outside of Savannah, Georgia. And Lee predicted that they could never breach the walls of the fort with artillery from the distance that they were firing. It took the Federals 36 hours to do just that. So the idea that Lee was not all that good as a military commander preceded him to Richmond. But on the wounding of Joe Johnston on the 30th of May, 1862, brought Lee into command of the Army, and he took steps to fortify Richmond. But he pointed out that the Confederate Army had to act aggressively, offensively. They couldn't just wait for a siege because the siege would be inevitably successful. And so he counterattacked in the 7 days, caught McClellan's army divided, and pushed it back about 20 miles away from Richmond. Then he saw Pope's army coalescing around Washington, D.C. and moving down into central Virginia. And Lee hurried northward, first just sending Jackson, then bringing most of the rest of the army. And as you pointed out, fought a hard-fought battle at Cedar Mountain on August 9th. Lee will then attack John Pope's Union Army at 2nd Manassas on the field of the old first battle of the war. And in 3 days will thrash Pope's army and send it into demoralized retreat into Washington, trying to cut them off at Chantilly, and again, inflicting severe damage on the Union Army, as you mentioned, 2 division commanders killed in the Union Army. So Lee is on a roll, and he wants to keep going. He believes that aggressive offensive operations is the way for the Confederacy to achieve independence. Now, for the Union, as we pointed out, there is a large coalescence of Union troops in Washington, D.C. of various commands. A lot of them are demoralized. Pope's army from 2nd Manassas, certainly, and much of McClellan's army, very demoralized at having to retreat from the peninsula and all the hardships that they have endured. And Lincoln's initial concern is that Lee would attack the capital. And so he had taken all of McClellan's army that was with him and sent it out to Pope at Manassas. McClellan was in Alexandria with his headquarters guard and nothing more. But on September 2nd, Abraham Lincoln and his chief general, Henry Halleck, will place McClellan in command of the defenses of the capital. He is to place troops in the best position to defend the city should Lee attack, and McClellan begins doing that. Now, in giving this order to McClellan, Lincoln has gone over the head of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who does not care for McClellan at all. And so Lincoln goes to a cabinet meeting that afternoon where Stanton and others are circulating a letter asking for McClellan to be dismissed from the army. And Lincoln walks in and says, "Oh, I just put him in charge of the defenses." Stanton goes berserk, just absolutely furious. And when the order comes out to put McClellan in that command, Stanton is so angry he won't sign it. It goes out over the signature of one of his subordinates. Now, the next day, September 3rd, word is received in Washington that Lee's army is moving upstream to Leesburg, looking like they will cross there. And Lincoln again visits McClellan and asks him to put together an army to take the field to confront Lee in Maryland. Now, McClellan asks the logical question, who's going to command it? And he's told, we haven't decided yet. So McClellan starts putting together an army. He will take 2 of the corps from Pope's army. What had been Banks's old corps will now become the 12th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. He will take McDowell's corps, which McDowell is in disgrace at this point, and he will put Joe Hooker in command of it and make it the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac. He will take the 2nd, 5th, and 6th Corps of his Army of the Potomac and put them in this field army. And then he will take the 2 divisions of Burnside's North Carolina expedition and put 2 other divisions with them, Isaac Stevens's division from the South Carolina coast, minus Isaac Stevens, of course, and a division that had come in from Western Virginia made of Ohio troops, the Kanawha Division, under the command of Jacob Cox, and those 4 divisions will make up the 9th Corps. So he has an army now to take the field. Some of them have been beat up pretty badly at 2nd Manassas, like the 5th Corps. Others were not engaged there at all, like the 12th Corps. But he now has a field army. To fill in the gaps and make up the losses, he will sprinkle almost 19,000 of these new recruits into the various parts of this army. Men who had enlisted in August of 1862 are being put into an active field army in early September. And so he has an army that is capable of taking the field. And on September 5th, Lincoln and Halleck again will come to McClellan and tell him to take that army out of the Washington defenses to confront Lee, who they know now is centered at Frederick, Maryland. Lincoln, Halleck, and McClellan will agree on 2 broad goals of this campaign. One is to protect the cities of Washington and Baltimore. Washington is heavily defended. Baltimore has nothing and is the 3rd largest city in the country at that time and a major port. The other goal was to drive the Confederate Army back across the Potomac River out of Maryland. And so McClellan sets out on that mission. It is, I think, by all means, a conservative mission. It is not a risk anything, go destroy the Confederate Army mission, because the Union cause has suffered a huge, embarrassing defeat at 2nd Manassas. And next month, our elections starting. Can the Union sustain another demoralizing defeat? What happens then? So Lincoln has given a conservative mission to a conservative general. Under those and one more circumstance I should throw in. the order to take the army out of Washington and perform these two missions was never anywhere put in writing. Now, Lincoln can say, well, I never removed him from command of the army, so of course he's still in command of the army. But under those circumstances, Jay, how bold would you be?
I didn't have the brilliance or the political savvy of Abraham Lincoln, that's for sure. I don't know that I would have risked that. As you mentioned, Lee was moving already across the Potomac near Leesburg at White's Ford to the Confederate bands playing Maryland, My Maryland as they entered the state, which at that area of Maryland, it's still sort of in the southern part of the state, had a lot of Southern sympathizers, Maryland, of course, being a border state. As they moved north and entered Frederick, as you mentioned, they started to encounter a different viewpoint. Now they were in the world of the Marylanders who were on the side of the Federals, who identified more with the North. And of course, a famous legend in the city of Frederick, as Jackson, in this case, Jackson's Corps marched through, was that they were noticed by a woman named Barbara Fritchie in her house who had a Union Star Spangled Banner Union flag waving in outside her upper floor. The house is still there, of course. And John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a famous poem that had Barbara Fritchie defying the Confederate forces. This probably wasn't fact, but it sure made for great legend at the time and enduring beyond the Civil War and 19th century. Nevertheless, Lee's troops were gathering and marching north, and already at Frederick, they were in a position to threaten Baltimore, being west on the on actually a major railroad going between Baltimore and the western part of Maryland. So they were poised to indeed threaten Baltimore if they wanted to.
Absolutely.
And at that point, Lee was in Frederick and having his corps of the Army of Northern Virginia fan out with certain objectives. They were only about 40 miles west of Baltimore, could have threatened that direction, but chose to go other directions. And so what happened next, Tom, when they got to that point and under these trusted corps commanders that Lee had, personalities that we now know very well, what did they do from that point?
Well, you mentioned a couple of important things, Jay. First of all, again, it is a Southern diplomatic goal that every slave state should be a Confederate state. And Maryland, of course, was still a slave state. Slavery was lawful in Maryland. And so the Davis government in Richmond wanted Maryland to join the Confederacy, and they portrayed Maryland as a state that was held into the Union by point of bayonet, that the federal occupation, particularly in Baltimore, had forced Marylanders to submit to Union authority, but there was this belief in the Confederacy that Marylanders' hearts were with the southern states. It was seen as the northernmost southern city, Baltimore, and I don't find that Lee really bought into that theory at all. I think Lee understood that Maryland was not likely to rise up and join the Confederacy simply because Lee's moved an army into Frederick for a couple of reasons. First of all, he is not there to occupy. And so take it down to the average citizen. If you're living in Frederick and Lee's army marches in and you get out your Confederate flag and wave it out the window and say 3 cheers for Jeff Davis, hurrah. And then 5 days later, the Union Army marches into Frederick, and all your neighbors are going to go, he was one of them, right? So most people don't really jump up one way or the other about this. And frankly, the parts of Maryland that were strongly sympathetic to the South, the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland, where they're growing tobacco and have large farms and lots of slaves, is not where Lee's invading. He goes into Frederick County, which was a large agricultural county, but kind of on the borderline, not so much tobacco growing and international crop, but more local, essentially grain crops. And when he moves into Washington County, even more so. A lot of German settlers, less sympathy for slavery. And so he is invading the part of Maryland that is probably the least sympathetic to the South. And I think Lee understands and knows that. He mentions in a letter to President Davis on the September 7th, the day before he issues this proclamation to Marylanders about rise up and throw off the yoke of Union tyranny and all that. He sends a letter to Davis that says, situated as Maryland is, I do not expect a general rising of the population on our behalf. He knows, not going to happen. But it's good window dressing. You're coming into Maryland, so you might as well call yourself a liberator rather than an invader. You know, hi, I'm here to burn your fence rails, run off your cattle, and empty your barns. No, you know, so you're there as a liberator. If the people don't want to be liberated, that's their problem. And as I mentioned, running off cattle and that sort of thing, this is the true weakness of Lee's army. He has battle-tested troops for the most part, no rookies in his army. He has leaders who have risen to the ranks that they're holding by essentially merit. Jackson has proved himself to be a very audacious and capable commander. James Longstreet, the same. I think Lee is auditioning Daniel Harvey Hill in this campaign and finds him somewhat lacking, but he's still a good division commander. And, you know, he has a very experienced army, but his problem is logistics. He doesn't have the food to feed them. And as Napoleon remarked, an army travels on its stomach. And so he is having to confiscate food to feed his army. And this was one of the secondary goals of the campaign. If he can keep his army in the north during harvest season, September, then the southern crops could be harvested and stored for his army through the winter to feed them. And of course, living off the land in the north while these crops are being harvested in the south was part of the plan. But Lee is going to find difficulty getting enough food to feed his army, and that's a problem. Now, the northern campaign for the Army of Northern Virginia, his morale is very high. These troops have been on a wave of success and are confident in Lee and in their commanders. And this is very opposite of what we see in the Army of the Potomac. Some of the soldiers are very elated that McClellan is back in command. He has always taken good care of them. But this is frequently pointed out as a flaw of McClellan, is that he pays a lot of attention to logistics. Soldiers that are well fed and well equipped and well supplied can fight well. I'm not saying that Lee's army can't, but no matter what's in your heart, if there's nothing in your stomach, you're going to have trouble keeping up with the army. If you don't have shoes on your feet, no matter how dedicated you are to Southern independence, you're not going to be able to march on these macadamized roads in Western Maryland, because we had essentially stone crushed roads at that point in time. And that's going to tear up your feet. So logistics is Lee's weakness. McClellan, on the other hand, is organizing an army on the fly and having to lead it out of Washington with not everything that he would want to be acquired for a field army, but he realizes that the crisis of the moment requires him to do things that he ordinarily would not do. And he fans that army out on three broad fronts, one following the Potomac River, one following the direct road from Washington to Frederick, and one wing going up to block the national road leading to Baltimore to protect that city. Lee was in Frederick planning to move directly to Hagerstown. He says before, during, and after the campaign that his goal was to get to Hagerstown, only 5 miles from the Pennsylvania border, a road hub that if he held it, any pursuing force would have to disperse to cover all the roads that he might take out of there, which would weaken them while he would be concentrated. So Hagerstown was the key. He wanted to get there. But while he was in Frederick, you mentioned transportation routes, Jay, and this is critical. Crossing the Potomac, not only did he cross the Potomac, but he cut the C&O Canal, which was bringing supplies and men from upstream on the Potomac to Washington, D.C. He also has burned the bridges on the B&O Railroad at Monocacy Junction, one of only two east-west railroads in the country at that time. This was huge. And of course, he's also cut the telegraph lines to Washington, D.C. as well. So Lee was sitting in Frederick, providing some well-needed rest and recuperation for an army that had been on the march ever since spring, for the most part, letting these soldiers mend their clothing, wash their clothing, get something to eat, and rest a few days. He planned to move on to Hagerstown, but a Union garrison located at Harper's Ferry, where the Shenandoah and Potomac River come together, was still in place. McClellan had ordered them to be removed. Halleck had overruled him and said, no, they need to stay there. And once Lee left Virginia, he is tracing a line of supply for his army to Winchester, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. And those 14,000 Union soldiers are closer to his supply depot than he is. Now, I'm not a military genius, but when the enemy's closer to your supply depot than you are, you got a problem. And so to resolve that problem, Lee is going to, as you pointed out, split his army into 5 pieces, 3 of which, about 2/3 of the army, will be sent to surround Harper's Ferry. One branch under John Walker going back into Virginia and coming up to Harper's Ferry from the south. One branch under Jackson marching westward and then turning southward and coming to Harper's Ferry from the west, while 2 divisions under Lafayette McLaws and Richard Anderson will march west over the Catoctin Mountains and Elk Ridge, and into the valley between the Catoctins and Elk Ridge, turn south and approach Harper's Ferry from the north. In the meantime, Lee, with Longstreet's command, will move to Hagerstown, that goal that he wanted, and leave D.H. Hill's division at Boonesboro to again round up any escapees from Harper's Ferry. And then the army will concentrate at Boonesboro or Hagerstown and take the next step, maybe Pennsylvania, a big morale blow to invade a northern state. That's what's on Lee's mind.
Now, you mentioned that McClellan, of course, was a great organizer. He did build up morale. He had logistics on his mind, which is all important in any military campaign. He had a group of sub-commanders because this was a patchwork command. Some of them he was very close to, some of them not so much. And yet he pulled them together in the divisions that you described before to approach this campaign, and they were approaching on the particular paths that you mentioned earlier. We're going to describe those battles that preceded the Battle of Antietam, both those federal attacks on Lee's positions east of Antietam, and also the situation at Harper's Ferry, where, as Tom described, Confederate forces were surrounding that 14,000 force under General Miles, when we return. Soar into new adventures at the Hagerstown Aviation Museum, where something adventurous is always happening. Monthly open airplane days, Young Eagle flights, car shows, and more at the Hagerstown Airport or online at Facebook and HagerstownAviationMuseum.org. Welcome back. We are about to get into the combat engagements of the Antietam campaign. Before we do that, I want to mention briefly that you're going to see video clips here, and they are from the award-winning television series Smithsonian's Great Battles of the Civil War. Later in the program, we'll tell you how you can get copies of that on DVD for your home library. But back to Tom. And Tom, we're about to embark on the actual combat engagement, the actual firing going on. There were a few skirmishes earlier, cavalry, a few small skirmishes, but the real combat started in those 2 areas that we mentioned before, both in Harper's Ferry and in the area called South Mountain, which is actually not a mountain. It's a long north-south, northeast, southwest running ridge of the Appalachians where a lot of action took place. So set us up for those pre-Antietam, pre-Bloodiest Day battles.
Well, yes, thanks, Jay. As we pointed out, Lee has dispatched about 2/3 of his army to surround and neutralize the garrison at Harper's Ferry. Frankly, I don't think he cared if they retreated or whatever, but Jackson seemed intent on surrounding them and will essentially bombard them on the 14th of September, causing them to surrender on the 15th. So the siege and capture of Harper's Ferry, if you will, 3 Confederate forces approaching from 3 different directions to surround this vulnerable city. If you've been there, you know the town of Harper's Ferry is down at river level, and defending the town of Harper's Ferry is like trying to defend the bottom of a well. The only way you can do it is hold the high ground around it. And after a couple of fairly significant scraps, the Confederates will lose control of that high ground, and 14,000 Federal soldiers then are vulnerable. About 1,500 cavalry managed to escape on the night of the 14th, but on the 15th of September, 12,500 U.S. soldiers will surrender to Stonewall Jackson personally, leading this operation. Largest surrender of United States forces in our entire history, and would remain that way up until the fall of Bataan in World War II. This was a big deal. And if he had captured Harper's Ferry and then gone back to Virginia, this might have been a very different war. But Lee has moved on to Hagerstown and believes that he has enough time to gather the scattered parts of his army together before he moves on. He does not. McClellan has pursued Lee's army pretty vigorously. The 3 branches of his army will come together at Frederick on the 13th of September. Lead elements there by the 12th, most of the army there by the 13th, and certainly on the 14th of September, the Union Army is concentrating in Frederick. McClellan recognizes that Lee's army has been separated. He's well aware of it. He knows Harper's Ferry is surrounded on the 12th of September. He knows that Lee has moved on to Hagerstown from other Union intelligence sources. And of course, on the 13th, a Union soldier finds an abandoned Confederate order outlining what Lee's doing in the siege and capture of Harper's Ferry and moving northward. I'm one of those people who think that Special Order 191 is overblown a bit. It doesn't tell much to McClellan that he does not already know. It has some things that are contradictory to what he knows. Special Order 191 says Jackson will cross the Potomac at Shepherdstown. McClellan knows he crossed at Williamsport. 191 says nothing about Lee and Longstreet going to Hagerstown, but McClellan knows they're there. So I find Special Order 191 to be a burp in the overall campaign, but not that big a deal. That McClellan, through this entire march, had been issuing orders to his soldiers to, at the night of what their objectives for marching would be the next day. So on the 13th of September, the day that the lost order is found, and before McClellan has issued any order that has anything to do with finding 191, the lead elements of McClellan's army are 3 miles away from Turner's Gap on South Mountain. That's being aggressive.
And of course, 191 being famous as being discovered as the wrapping for 3 cigars. That's the legend that has endured about Special Order 191.
Well, we have a letter from the sergeant who was involved in the finding, John Bloss, that he wrote on September 25th to his family. And in the letter, he says 2 cigars.
2 cigars.
But other sources say 3 cigars. So maybe he kept one and told his family he found 2.
That might have been resourceful for a federal sergeant at the time. Yes.
Yes. But yeah, So a lot of people make a big deal out of Special Order 191. I just don't think it's all that important. McClellan is being pretty aggressive already. In fact, on the 16th of September, when Lee is writing to Davis, his president, talking about the 13th of September, he says to Davis that he finds the Union Army advancing more rapidly than convenient. And that's before anything that has anything to do with 191 affects the campaign. So McClellan is moving with unusual speed and aggressiveness. And I think that gets lost in the shuffle sometimes. So on the 14th of September, he issues orders to take possession of Turner's Gap on South Mountain. 191 says nothing about the Confederates holding those gaps. But on the night of the 13th, when he is informed that the Union Army is advancing more rapidly than convenient, Lee issues orders for some of the troops, D.H. Hill's troops in Boonesboro and McLaws's troops in Pleasant Valley, to go back and block the road gaps on South Mountain to buy some time, because this Harper's Ferry operation is not complete and he needs it completed to concentrate the army. And as you point out, this is what sparks the big battles. On September 14th, there will be fighting at Turner's Gap on the north, at the National Road. And that National Road is essentially the equivalent of a 19th century interstate. It is the main road. It is a gravel, hard surface. It can carry innumerable wagons and horses in any weather. And so there's fighting to take Turner's Gap, where the National Road crosses. A mile south of there is Fox's Gap. The initial Union attack was moving towards Turner's Gap, informed that it was being held by Confederates. They decided to take the old Sharpsburg Road and cross South Mountain at Fox's Gap a mile south. As they approach that, they discover it too is held by Confederate forces, and fighting erupts at Fox's Gap around 9 o'clock in the morning. And pretty soon, the Union Army 9th Corps will be assaulting Fox's Gap, and the Union Army 1st Corps assaulting Turner's Gap, and contending initially with Confederate troops under Daniel Harvey Hill in his division. But Lee, in the morning of the 14th, is ordering a rapid march from Hagerstown back to South Mountain to defend those gaps with Longstreet's command, which will begin to put troops into both of those battles through the day. And also, William Franklin, one of McClellan's trusted subordinates, is leading the 6th Corps towards Crampton's Gap, trying to cross over South Mountain, drive away the Confederates laying siege to Harper's Ferry, and rescue that Harper's Ferry garrison. Franklin has got a tall order in front of him to march from Adamstown in Frederick County over Catoctin Mountain, across Middletown Valley, take Crampton's Gap, and then fall on the flank and rear of McLaws. So on the 14th, you're going to see fighting at all three gaps. Crampton's in the south, Fox's and Turner's Gap about 5 and 6 miles north of there. You'll see about 28,000 Federal troops involved in that attack, combating about 18,000 Confederates, trying to defend those gaps. You'll see about roughly 3,000 casualties on each side, a lot of hard fighting. In the twilight on the 14th of September, a Union Corps commander and a very capable general, General Jesse Reno, will be killed at Fox's Gap. A Confederate general had been killed there earlier. This is Sam Garland defending Fox's Gap. So we already see 2 generals killed in this campaign. And by nightfall, the Federals are in possession of Crampton's Gap, have driven a very small Confederate force holding it through the gap and down into Pleasant Valley. By nightfall, the Federals are in possession of Fox's Gap. And although the Confederates still hold Turner's Gap on the National Road, it is very tenuous because the Union have driven the Confederates from the high ground surrounding the gap. And as soon as it's daylight, that gap will be in Union hands. Hood comes up to the Mountain House, the stagecoach inn that's at the crest of Turner's Gap that night and meets D.H. Hill and several other generals and asks in a fairly loud voice what the situation is. And they all turn toward him and go, shh. That's how close the Union troops were.
That being John Bell Hood, who had established himself as a very trusted commander from the 7 days on, of course.
Yeah, an aggressive leader, quite a combatant. As Robert E. Lee said of John Bell Hood, all of the lion and none of the fox. A hard hitter, but not very necessarily clever. Now, South Mountain is also the first battle that Lee's army has fought that he never saw. Because of his injured hands, when he fell before leaving Manassas, and he broke a bone in his right hand and strained ligaments in both hands. And so from August 31st until through the Battle of Antietam, his hands are bandaged and in splints. So he has to ride in an ambulance. And if you've ever been on South Mountain, you would realize that's no place to be in a horse-drawn ambulance. You can't see anything. So he is at the foot of the mountain, essentially rushing troops up to fight at Turner's Gap. But at 8 o'clock that night, still unaware of what happened at Crampton's Gap, but knowing what's happened at Fox's and Turner's, he issues an order that begins with the words, "The day has gone against us, and the army will return to Virginia." So this grandiose campaign to perhaps win the war for the Confederacy, to achieve independence. Now he's saying, we got to get out of here. Now, he will hold open the possibility he could come back. He's not completely retreating, but he wants to go back into Virginia to concentrate the army because Jackson has got almost 2/3 of the army at Harper's Ferry, and Lee has been fighting with about 1/3 of the army. And so they will go into the little town of Boonesboro on the other side of South Mountain. And from there was a privately owned turnpike, the Boonesboro-Shepherdstown Turnpike, which would lead westward to Shepherdstown, where there was a bridge across the Potomac River up until 1861, when Joe Johnston burned it early in the war, and it has not been rebuilt. And so Lee is planning on using a colonial era ford on the Potomac about 1.25 miles south of the bridge to get out of Maryland and back into Virginia to unite with Jackson. That is his plan at 8 o'clock at night on the 14th of September as he retreats from South Mountain. Now, through the night, he will get more information. He finds out that Crampton's Gap has fallen and that McLaws is holding Franklin's Union 6th Corps at bay. But that again means he's in even deeper trouble than he thought. He sends out engineering officers. He's used to doing his own reconnoitering. He can't. And he's looking to see if there's any high ground between Boonesboro and Sharpsburg where he could hold back a Union pursuit. His engineer officers say that there isn't really any defensible ground. He moves on to a high meadow on the pike on the eastern bluffs of Sharpsburg, on the eastern side of the Antietam Creek. And it's just about dawn on the 15th. He gets out of his ambulance to survey the ground, and a courier dashes up with a message from Jackson. He had left Harper's Ferry at midnight, ridden through the night, finally finds Lee about daylight, and delivers a message that says that Jackson is confident Harper's Ferry will surrender in the morning. This is what we would call a game changer. Lee, on the eastern bluffs, looks at the western bluffs of the creek and sees high ground. Not only does he see high ground, but he knows that behind that high ground, there is a direct road from Sharpsburg to Hagerstown, where he has wanted to go. And so he will change his mind and tell the troops that are retreating from Boonesboro to cross over the bridge on the Antietam Creek on the turnpike and take position on the high ground east of Sharpsburg on the bluffs. And he will send orders to Jackson to bring his forces up to Sharpsburg as rapidly as possible. Lee is taking a gamble here, Jay. He's facing a pursuing Union army with 18,000 men. And they have made a night retreat. They are disorganized and maybe even a little bit demoralized at having been pushed out of the gaps the way they were. And yet Lee is confident that he can put that artillery in position on those bluffs and force McClellan to stop that pursuit long enough for Jackson to get there. And I can't say that I have proof, but it is my belief that he's not planning on a battle. He's planning on moving to his left up the Sharpsburg Pike. This is the Robert E. Lee that they called Granny Lee around Richmond because he had them digging trenches and building log forts. And yet he's on that bluff west of Antietam Creek for a day and a half before the battle begins, and nobody turns one shovel full of dirt. Not one.
Granny
He's not
Lee,
entrenching.
Granny Lee becomes gambling Bobby Lee.
Absolutely. And it's a huge gamble. And one that, as we know today, didn't work out to his advantage, but he doesn't know that at the time. He thinks the goal is worth the risk. And of course, as we'll see, the Union Army pursues. And as McClellan arrives at the front and sees this array of cannons and troops, Lee makes a remark to Longstreet that afternoon. And he says, "Let all of your guns be seen." So he's running a bluff, and it works. Now, because essentially McClellan is pursuing Lee on the same road that Lee took for the most part, he's trying to move an army that's bigger than Lee's over the same road. He's got a heck of a traffic jam going on. On the afternoon of the 15th of September, he has, by late afternoon, 2 divisions of the Army of the Potomac that could actually attack. And those 2 divisions are less troops than Lee has on the other side of the creek. So McClellan attacking on the 15th is pure fantasy, not going to happen. On the 16th, this is September, and the air is cool and the creek is still warm. And so first thing in the morning, there's fog. He can't see the ridge. And McClellan's first question is Lee still there? Did he retreat during the night? There's no point in ordering an attack until you know whether the enemy is in fact there or not. And so he sends reconnaissance troops across the bridge on the turnpike. They run into Confederates and come back. So he knows somebody's still there, but is it a rear guard while the rest of the army is already crossing the river? He doesn't know that. As the fog lifts on the 16th, he will find out that Lee's army is there, and he begins to reconnoiter where to approach them. And again, it seems a little perhaps odd to us today, but Antietam Creek is an obstacle for an army to cross. There are 3 bridges nearby that he could use, one north of the Turnpike Bridge called the Upper Bridge, or Hit Bridge for the family that lived near it, one south of the Turnpike called the Roarsville or Rohrbach Bridge, but will eventually go down as the Burnside Bridge. So he's got 3 bridges and a couple of usable fords on Antietam Creek to approach Lee on high ground. And so McClellan plans to essentially put his troops to threaten all parts of Lee's lines. He's going to send Burnside's 9th Corps down to confront the lower bridge. He's going to send the 1st and then later the 12th Corps to cross the upper bridge. Lee doesn't have enough troops to block that one, and position themselves on the Confederate left flank. These moves are made in daylight. There's no effort on McClellan's part to make this a surprise. Lee is a good engineer himself. He recognizes what's the weak point of his line, the left. That's why he sends Hood's division up there on the 15th and more troops as Jackson's troops arrive, because he knows that's the weak point of his line. McClellan is crossing troops on Upper Bridge to confront that part of his line, because you can't leave 1/3, almost 1/2 of the Confederate line unopposed and then attack someplace else, they will go to confront you, right? So McClellan is threatening all points of Lee's lines without really giving any indication of which or how many will be the main attack.
It sets up quite a scenario for what is going to happen next. One footnote I'd like to mention back to South Mountain. And of course, there are a lot of things about the Civil War period that have remained part of American history and American life. Tom mentioned the death of General Jesse Reno. He was a very popular commander, so popular that sometime after the war, a group of his men, his former soldiers, moved to the western part of the state of Nevada and founded a city which they named in honor of him. It's called Reno. When we return, we will start with this great setup that Tom has created for us, full of suspense about how the Battle of Antietam will unfold. At Monroe Publications, we like to say history is an open browser window. Open monroepublications.com in your browser and explore our many excellent history offerings for all media. This month, featuring the award-winning Smithsonian's Great Battles of the Civil War complete DVD set at a special price. Monroe Publications, history, nostalgia, entertainment.